I went apartment hunting yesterday and a lot of crazy things happened. In this video, I'm going to give you guys a little bit of a story time and tell you guys what happened while I went apartment hunting because I don't have a dorm and the situation was a little bit strange. So as you guys probably know, I'm not originally from China. I have not ever really lived in Beijing, China permanently, but right now I don't have a dorm, and so I need to try to find somewhere that I can live that's pretty close to campus, because right now I'm living in my grandparents' apartment, but it's a good hour commute to the campus. And so yesterday I went with my mom and we went to 7 different apartments that were near campus. The first apartment complex that we went to was very old, and I don't want to say run down, but honestly it was just slightly run down, and it was like the walls were not painted. They were more like almost like a mud house. I don't really know how to explain exactly, but it was just in very bad condition and it did not smell the greatest. It was very dark. There wasn't great lighting. It was honestly a little bit creepy and I just couldn't see myself living there. But the rooms themselves were like extremely small. I would say that maybe they were the size of like maybe my closet, but slightly bigger, and they just had like a bed, and the bed was the only thing that you could really fit in that room, and there was like a tiny bit of walking space, and then you would go out, and then it was just like this very short small hallway, and then you would leave the apartment complex and then obviously go to campus if that's the destination that you were heading to. But when I saw those, I couldn't imagine myself or any of my friends or my family living in those apartments, but I do know that there are people that live there, and I do know that for some people that's the only kind of living condition that they're able to find. And honestly, I think the biggest part that bothered me was the fact that those apartments were really expensive for like the quality and conditions, but I think that they're able to raise those apartments to that price mainly because there's a lot of students that are desperate in need of housing, because unfortunately Peking University doesn't have enough apartments or enough dorms for all of its international students, or even students in general. From what I understand, Peking University, a lot of like 80% of the students at the university don't have housing because it's just a very small school and they don't have enough space to fit that many dormitories on top of all of the classes and stuff like that. So a lot of students, even mainland students, have to end up go and find houses and apartments outside because there's just not enough space for everyone, which I think is not amazing, but it's just what it is, and I think that's just how Peking University is. I know that Tsinghua University is a much bigger campus and there's more housing options for students, but it is just what the situation is. But I'm going on a rant. Back to the apartment. So after we went to like that small apartment complex was about like 5 minutes walking distance from the south entrance of Peking University. So in terms of like distance and location, it was very convenient, but the housing people felt no need, I guess, to renovate the apartment just because students are going to need houses, right? And so they're going to buy, even if the house is very run down, if the apartment's very run down, if they have no other option, then they're obviously going to have to rent it. So honestly, I'm pretty lucky to have this option in staying in my grandparents' apartment. Although the commute is a little farther, at least I have that option so that if I'm not able to find an apartment, I can just stay here. But that obviously would not be the best situation, I would say, because the commute is difficult, especially with traffic and all of that expenses and things like that. And also just the social aspect of living in a dorm is something that I don't want to miss. I do think that worst case scenario, I probably will have to live off campus for 1 year and hopefully be able to get a dorm the second year, but we'll see. But after we went to that apartment complex, we got onto these like motorbikes that the people that were taking us to see the apartments were riding, and so I sat behind one and my mom sat behind one, and it was just a little bit weird because I had to like, obviously when you're sitting in the back seat, there's not a whole lot of like space, so you get the point, right? Like when you're sitting on a motorcycle and someone's in front of you and someone's behind you, you're going to be relatively in close proximity with that other person, and I just wasn't super comfortable with that because I had no idea who this guy was. But I mean, it was okay because he was like relatively nice, I would say, and so there wasn't too much of an issue with that. But we rode the bike for about like 5 to 10 minutes to a different apartment complex, and this one was a little bit better, but I would say that the conditions, like the overall structure of the apartment was not the best, and the space was very tight, I would say, and just like it was very run down, very not what I imagined, I guess. And I guess you could also say that's because I've been very sheltered in the sense because I've lived in a fairly large house my entire life. So just having to transition from a huge house to a tiny apartment that's a little bit bigger than my closet is just a very big transition. And also there's a security issue in terms of whether or not the apartment is safe, and so that was just something else that we also needed to consider. And obviously once we were looking at those apartments, we were like, my mom was like, this might not be the best place to live. We went to a slightly better area, but the only issue was that it was a lot farther than the apartments that we've seen before. So riding an electric bike would have taken about 15 to 20 minutes. So walking obviously would be way longer, and then even riding a regular bike would probably take up to half an hour. Here's the thing that happened that was the most mind-blowing. So while we were on the bike, I was talking to the guy in front of me, and he was explaining how houses are very hard to find, especially for students, but Peking University has a lot of students that don't find housing. And he mentioned how there were international students. It was very difficult for them too, because a lot of renters weren't willing to rent out to foreigners because there would be a lot of paperwork involved, and the police might often come and check to make sure that the person living there was actually living there. That's just how the policy is kind of for foreigners who do rent houses, so it's a little bit more of a hassle, and so a lot of renters weren't willing to do that. And when I was listening to this, I was like, oh, interesting. I mean, and then I mentioned, because obviously it applied to me, so I was like, I'm an international student too. And then I didn't really say anything, so I was like, okay, I guess maybe it's not that big of a deal. Maybe it's because the two other international students were from Singapore, and so I was like, okay, maybe because I'm from the US it might not be as big of an issue. But then later we went over to the new house, and then there was the renter who was renting the apartment, and I forget exactly how this was brought into the conversation, but it was mentioned that I was an international student, and suddenly things changed very dramatically, and the renter was like, oh, we can't rent you this apartment. And then my mom was like, why? Are you not renting out to international students? You're not willing to? And then the guy was just like, no, we can't. And obviously that just meant that there was a lot more paperwork involved with that, and a lot of renters, like I mentioned before, landlords aren't wanting to put themselves through that, which I totally understand. But it was just very awkward because there were two guys that were with us, right? And so one of the guys was like, oh, that's crazy. And then he looked at the other guy, and the other guy was the person that I was riding with. And then the other guy was like, oh, what? You're an international student? And I was like, bro, I literally told you while we were riding on the bike that I was an international student. And he was like, oh, that's awkward. I thought that you were, he didn't explicitly say it, but I knew what he meant. He thought that I was a fake international student. And honestly, I was a little bit offended by that, because what about me says that I'm a fake international student? I guess it's because sometimes when people hear me talk in Mandarin, they don't think necessarily that I am a foreigner, because I do think that my accent is relatively decent, and so my mannerisms too, I would say, aren't super foreigner-like, if that makes sense. I don't really know, but I guess he thought that because for international students in the past, there were students who were actually from China, and they had been in China their entire lives. They went to school in China, but then they went overseas to get a kind of a different, I'm not entirely sure, a different citizenship or something like that, to say that they were international students, and then they would go back and apply to these top universities like Peking University or Tsinghua, and that would get them accepted and then if they didn't do that, they otherwise wouldn't have been accepted into these universities. And so I guess that guy thought that that was what I was doing, because I guess my Chinese was a little bit better than he expected. And I was just like, no, buddy, I'm from America. I was born and raised in America. And then the landlord, he was like, he looked at me and he asked me so are you, and I was like, no, I am American. I was born in Canada, but raised in America my entire life. I've lived there my entire life, received my education there, but that was just kind of what the situation was, and it was very awkward. And I guess that was honestly something that I was a little bit concerned about, people thinking that I was a fake international student. Actually, on YouTube, there has been maybe one or two people that have alluded to the fact that I was actually from China, and saying something about my accent, which I also don't really understand, what are you expecting? But that was just something that was very interesting, and I have a feeling that might happen more than once while I am in China. So, but I think that
once you interact with me a little bit more, you can probably tell that I am not from China, but it was just a very interesting experience, I will say. And so right now, I still don't have an apartment. There were only 2 apartments that they were able to offer to rent me, and the conditions weren't too bad, but it went through like the person that I was renting from wasn't like the actual landlord. It was the person that owned the house rented it out to someone else, and then that person was renting out to me, and often those kind of transactions aren't super safe. So my mom wasn't super comfortable with accepting that option. Right now I'm still looking, and hopefully we figure something out. Worst case scenario, I wait till next year and just jump on the dorms and hope and pray that I'm able to get something. But I just kind of wanted to share this experience with you guys, and I hope you found it interesting or learned something from it. But yeah, moral of the story, I don't really know what the moral is, honestly, but I'm not a fake international student, for anyone that was wondering or wasn't sure, and I will hopefully be able to find a place to live, and maybe there will be a dorm that opens up, but I'm thinking that's not probably going to happen. But I'm just excited for the school year to start, and we'll see how it goes.